Race is first and foremost a perceptive error. I see you and I don't see you. I impose a veil of myth and bias and prejudice and stereotype.
It's the same with gender. I walk into a room, you
somehow
also know that
on the left, there is much more willingness to question the reality of gender than there is to question the reality of race. I think I can say that categorically.
It's not only that I have value in the pride in being Black, is that I feel like it works for me.
That's the key. Yeah, you just said that's what no one says that out loud.
I have always struggled with the formulation that race isn't real, if I'm going to be really honest.
Really? With the biological argument?
I understand what people mean, that it is very difficult to define races given the porous parameters of the world. But I also think that sometimes it elides the obvious truth that there is nobody on the planet who, showing a picture of me, can't say she's Black.
Martin Luther King, now it's fashionable to say he didn't really mean that he wanted a colorblind society. Of course, the vision that we should all be trying to get to is a colorblind society. A color-conscious society is what the racists do want. That is what I did a long piece in the New Yorker where I actually talked to some of these white nationalists, including Richard Spencer. They want people to think of themselves in racialized ways, and then whites over here in Montana and Idaho, Blacks over there in the South, people in their own territories separate from each other, conscious always of their racial identity. 2 years ago in 2019, I was a visiting fellow at Bard, and Ibram X. Kendi came to speak. And he said, the white racist's dream is a colorblind society. That way the privilege and the racism can be hidden. And I just raised my hand and I said, that's just bullshit. That's not at all what they say. Listen, have you talked to them? They don't want a colorblind society at all. That's how they think that they lose what it is they're fighting for. They're fighting for white consciousness and solidarity.
Me, that's an argument. I think that Kendi's wrong, but it's also true that when we're talking about France, it doesn't allow you to tick a box. There's an understanding that that can obscure bias that is still ongoing, in the same way that we understand how important it was for the census to be taken so that people can't fall through the cracks. So that makes me believe that there's something in between. There's something in between a colorblind society and a race-crafting fetishization of whiteness. And it's making me think of this thing that I don't want to let go, which is what it is that I'm valuing in these non-white partners. What is that consciousness that I'm looking for and that I'm valuing, and is it right for me to value it? And it's not something that I've exclusively found in Black partners. But there is, I think, a there that is akin to the father that grew up poor, the mother that grew up poor, who looks at their kids and on some level can't relate because the kid has just never experienced what they've experienced. And maybe it's fine to not relate. Obviously, nobody wants their kid to be poor the same way we don't want our kids to be in a racially hierarchical society. But there does seem to me to be a loss when there isn't that same simpatico and understanding. And in a world that continues to be racist and hierarchical in the ways that it is, I feel like giving up that solidarity as one of the marginalized people feels premature, and like I'm giving up something that is actually very powerful and useful to me emotionally, rhetorically, politically.
Useful, but I would say it can be often a Pyrrhic victory. It's short-term useful. It doesn't create the society that I think we're actually, hopefully, people of good will are trying to achieve.
Can I not have solidarity along racial lines at the same time that I have solidarity along class lines? Of course. Because I'm from New York.
You can have solidarity. I mean, I've been very moved by the non-so-called BIPOC POC who have shown extraordinary sympathy with what's been going on since, the last summer. I mean, that is very moving. People who don't see themselves in the identity and get out and march and stand up. That's all to the good. But what I mean is that using identity as a way of empowering yourself, well, that's also what the white racists want to do too.
And yet you said, when we first brought up Rachel Dolezal, you said something like, I don't get it.
Well, there's obviously something that seems to be, it's also the case with a lot of the loudest anti-racists. There's something in Rachel Dolezal that seems to come from her own personal family dynamic. There's a strange relationship with her parents. She's responding to something she didn't feel like she fit in. I always, I'm somebody who has changed quite a bit from how I used to be too. So I'm always attuned to people who want to recreate themselves or something like that. She clearly decided to recreate herself. I think you could look at somebody like Nicole Hannah-Jones, and there hasn't been as much talk about how much her own family dynamic probably plays a role in how she constructs her politics and her national
she's
discourse.
also biracial.
Yeah, but you don't hear as much about that.
No, and I'm curious, what do you make of the fact that so many people who occupy this space as like kind of Black elites in journalism who are doing this work of translating Blackness to the broader public are either biracial or often immigrants? I'm thinking of people like Awesomely Lovey. I forget her real name. There's obviously the discourse that happens around who plays Harriet Tubman and all of these stories. It does feel like perhaps because of the 1 foot in, 1 foot out relationship, it's those people who end up being the first point of contact for a broad swath of white liberals. And I'm not necessarily sure that that's the best.
Well, I guess what I was also saying is that, and I would implicate myself in this, and this is what my first book is about. When you have people who grow up 1 foot in, 1 foot out, there can be a kind of overcompensation. And I think that some of the people that drive the national discourse on race right now are coming from a point of overcompensating in some ways. Oftentimes, they are not exactly the same as the people on whose behalf they are fighting. They have very different life experiences. And I think that it's interesting to think about, I'm not here to armchair psychoanalyze people, but I think with Rachel Dolezal, she's interesting to think about, but she's also so hyper specific that it doesn't necessarily tell us more about the larger issue, I think. That was my point.
Isn't she in some ways what you would hope? Is she in some ways an embodiment of the vision where people can adopt what it means to be, some version of what it means to be Black, regardless of what their biological identity is?
Well, it's this idea that if you can change from white to Black, then that means that there's something real about them. That means that there is a Blackness that you can change into. I guess I just don't find that persuasive. And so I don't really think very much about someone like Rachel Dolezal. But I guess it was the Black academics argument on Twitter that seems most persuasive to me, is that if we don't think race is real, then we shouldn't spend so much time policing what Rachel Dolezal does.
I have always struggled with the formulation that race isn't real, if I'm going to be really honest.
Really? With the biological argument?
I understand what people mean, that there's so much diversity within communities genetically, that there's so much similarity between all of us, and the little teeny sliver of our DNA that creates racial difference is minuscule, that it is very difficult to define races given the porous parameters of the world. But I also think that sometimes it elides the obvious truth that there is nobody on the planet who's shown a picture of me can't say she's Black.
Because they've been taught to say that. That's
fine. But it's not because of my culture. It's not because of the way I'm behaving in the picture.
Certain physical characteristics.
It's because literally how I look. And so the idea that there is no relationship between biology and race, to me, like, I understand what is meant by that when people say it, but it also, I think, really skips past the point. The reason we think that it's silly for Rachel Dolezal to do whatever it is she's doing is because at the end of the day, she's not racially Black, whatever that means. She's not genetically Black, whatever that means. She has to tan her skin
is Meghan Markle
and kink her hair.
Genetically Black, racially Black presenting? I mean, in Europe, people can struggle to understand why she's defining herself as Black.
Well, I'm a Black American, and I think everyone looks Black.
I do. I mean, yeah, when you're, I understand why Mariah Carey looks Black to people, but that's not necessarily what, I'm just saying that it's trickier than that, because you also have people, it's not a matter of having dark skin. You have people from other parts of the world that have dark skin, but who are not
Right, it's
Black.
a combination of
It's
things.
a combination of things. And I think it gets very tricky, and especially gets tricky at the margins. Everything falls apart.
It gets tricky at the margins, but for certain characteristics, there has to be a plausible hook. And I think even you recognize this when you have this conversation about your daughter, that for years and years, there have been these quadrant octune categories in a world that's very strictly policing race for the kind of financial and social reasons that existed during slavery. You could enforce that, but in a world where the policing isn't so strong, it feels less plausible, less credible to call a blonde-haired, blue-eyed child Black.
Mm-hmm.
And that is ultimately what you're wrestling with. If your child had come out looking more or less like you, I I think you might not have changed your mind.
But, I was already being confused in France because my hair is longer now, but when I used to shave my head, I mean, in France, I was racialized as Arab. And that became an identity people imposed on me. It doesn't make me Arab. It doesn't make me want to dig deeper into my Arabness or like accentuate.
Yeah, but it's a necessary, it's not sufficient, but it's a necessary, some, whatever you want to call it, genetic, aesthetic, physiognomic hook is necessary, but not sufficient.
Mm-hmm.
It seems to me.
It seems to me too, but I think that we have to be able to imagine a world where that's not the case anymore. And some people don't, Carlos Lozada in the Washington Post said, this argument doesn't compel me because I don't want to imagine that world. I want to be tribal. And to that, I don't really have an answer. I mean, I think that not being tribal is, superior to being tribal. But if someone doesn't share that kind of, premise, I'm not sure I can get them to it.
I was having this conversation about what it means to be a something, because recently I got into a little bit of a tangle with a congressman named Richie Torres.
Oh, yeah, of course.
And I was talking to a Latino friend of mine and, thinking about Richie Torres and his background. And I believe Richie Torres grew up with his Black mom and his father. The name Torres is from a parent that he wasn't raised by. And my understanding is that he doesn't really speak Spanish. And so I was talking to my, this Puerto Rican friend of mine. And we were joking that, if we got married and I took your last name, does that make me just as Latino as
you would
Richie
easily
Torres?
Be Dominican? Right? You would easally be Dominican.
Right. So there's a way that the fact that there are Latinos that look like me, the same way there's, he is Latino, but there are, me and Richie Torres were in the same family of people, and plenty of Latinos look like both of us. But he at least has one Latino parent. I don't. But suddenly I have this last name. It's like Catherine Garcia in the New York mayoral race. A lot of people just assumed that she was Latina because there are white Latinas and she could be Latina and no one really questions it. And she talked a lot about having Latino children, which she does.
Yeah.
And
this stuff is nonsense.
So
Brie. That's what I'm saying. This is nonsense.
So do I, Elizabeth Warren is another example.
This stuff is nonsense.
What does it start to mean? And I was saying I would feel very guilty if I were to be, let's say, Briahna Torres, applying for some scholarship or something intended to go to Hispanics, because that is not my own cultural heritage and tradition. Just like if I were Elizabeth Warren, even if I did have some reasonable quotient of Native American heritage, which I'm not trying to be that person, but like many Black Americans, it's true.
Yeah, I have more than she does, I believe.
I'm sure everyone in this room does. Sorry. But, it would still, I could be a quarter Native American if I get the test, and I would still not feel like it was appropriate of me to take a spot, as it were, or hold myself out as Native American in any kind of professional or academic context.
I don't think that there should be spots reserved for abstract categories.
Well, that's a whole other conversation about affirmative action. I think it's worth having, and I have some complicated feelings about it as well. But I would feel, regardless, the system being what it is, guilty about it, because my understanding is that these systems are in place to confer benefit to historically marginalized groups and to, in some ways, boost cultural representation that I'm not privy to. I was not raised Native. I don't know anything about it. And it would be a waste of resources. I'll just go take the Black slot. I know plenty about that, And so that is all for me to say that I do think that there needs to be, I think that when we say race isn't biological, I think that does obscure the extent to which we all understand that there is something physical.
But that's what I'm saying. And that's what Walter Ben Michael's point was. That's actually nefarious. We do this slippage. So we use the language very imprecisely and we mean two things at the same time. And that type of fuzzy thinking is what doesn't allow us to get past some of these problems. Race is first and foremost a perceptive error. We see something, I see you, and I don't see you. I impose a veil of myth and bias and prejudice and stereotype.
It's the same with gender. I walk into a room, you
somehow
also know that
on the left, there is much more willingness to question the reality of gender than there is to question the reality of race. I think I can say that categorically. There is more willingness in the mainstream to question the reality of gender and even biological sex than there is. It is not a mainstream position. What I'm trying to argue is something that a lot of progressives who will feel fine about questioning other types of constructs just don't want to embrace. because it seems somehow anti-Black.
Yeah.
But logically, there's a slippage where they move between the ways that they use the biological or the constructed. And it's a source of immense frustration for me. We can't speak honestly about these things. And part of the reason we can't speak honestly is because we refuse to speak precisely.
I do think I keep coming back to this pride point. I think a lot of the resistance that I'm feeling within myself as I'm trying to sincerely wrestle with what you're saying, and I think that there's something there, is that it's not only that I have value in the pride in being Black, is that I feel like it works for me.
That's the key. Yeah, you just said that's what no one says that out loud.
And it's protecting me in a world that is predominantly white and anti-Black.
We got to it right there.
Yeah.
And it's a source of power, and it's certainly working for the people who are driving the conversation on race right now. But it's not working for our society.
Without it, would I be fighting? I feel like what drives me to fight for poor people, to advocate for a politics that lifts up poor people, is because I know my own people are disproportionately represented. I think there's a real chance that if I were not Black and didn't have that sense of solidarity with Black people who are disproportionately poor and low income, that I would have taken my Harvard degree, gone off to the firm, and not thought twice about what I did with my life and whether it was socially beneficial.
So then what you articulate there, what was your critique of Ta-Nehisi Coates then, from a socialist perspective?
Oh, it's because he perceives racism, not just race to be fixed, but racism to be kind of fixed and almost inherent to whiteness as a category. And he perceives social progress to require an end to racism because he doesn't believe that white people can ever be incentivized politically by anything other than their racial interests. At the same time, he doesn't offer a prescription for how to, quote, end racism, which leaves you in a circular holding pattern of just going on in this horrible country until people do something, this abstraction called people coming to terms with race. Like we have to have a national conversation and coming to terms with, which means nothing and is never going to happen and is not a thing. And so to me, that's the Afro-pessimism. That's the setting up a kind of path that goes right into a wall. It's like a staircase to nowhere. And my feeling is that racism is of course real. I'm not going to disagree with 99% of his lengthy essay. The 10% that I have a problem with is not the defining of the redlining and the need for reparations and all the things. I'm with you. My belief, though, is that it is possible, and in fact, it is incumbent on us to try to access those other tethers of solidarity, to offer white people something more than the wages of whiteness, to convince them that there's something that they can get out of having solidarity with me or some other working class person that is more than what they get from Tucker Carlson patting them on their head and saying, you're better because you're white. And I think that you look at what happened in Virginia with the governor's race that just passed, and you see that the right was able to completely win an election, completely co-opt the narrative to make it about critical race theory. And people are like, I saw a Jamel Hill tweet that says, white people are just racist.
Right.
That is what it is.
Her mother voted for Donald Trump, by the way. Her Black mother voted for Donald Trump. She's tweeted about that.
I did not know that. That's a fun fact. But my feeling is that's a cop-out. And that if your politics are so crap that people are more attracted to the abstract idea that their kids are being taught something they can't even define in school, instead of saying, well, maybe CRT isn't great, but here, want some minimum wage? Right. Want some $15 an hour? Want some pre-K, universal pre-K? Want some elder care? Want some hearing, dental, and vision in your Medicare? I suspect my political belief is that matters more to people if you frame it up that way and just don't engage in some of these dumb culture war things. But instead, liberals want to fight on the racism battle. They want to argue people out of racism, which is never how anyone has ever stopped being racist.
I tend to agree with everything you said, but I also would say that a mistake that was made in Virginia, and I fear it's going to continue to be made, is that a lot of the elite commentary is simply to deny that anything is going on in the schools. And so I wrote an op-ed with Jason Stanley, Camille Foster, and David French in the New York Times in the summer that got us very little favor on the left because were considered, too little, too late, and certainly made enemies on the right. But we said, we're against the CRT bans. We're against these crazy laws that are being passed. But at the same time, it's a mistake for the left to deny that anything is different in the teaching of students in school.
Yeah.
Kids are doing privilege walks. They're not reading Derek Bell in school, but they're being told to take 2 steps forward if your parents own a home, take 1 step backward if you...
Which is maybe fine and defensible, but don't pretend that that's not a thing.
Right. Don't say nothing is going on. People know that you're lying to them. People can see with their own eyes.
And it makes it seem like you're hiding something that is shameful, and then they don't understand it, but they know it's shameful.
Big part of the problem. And it terrifies me for 2024.
I agree. It's going to be very bad in 2024. I don't want to leave on a pessimistic note, but it seems like that's all there is. And I've kept you for a very long time, and I really appreciate the time you've spent. We didn't get to cancel culture.
Good.
The Harpers letter. But look, there are a lot of interviews that you've done out there about those things, and I hope you'll come back and talk to us sometime. I think it would be great to get you on a panel with some folks that maybe you've had disagreements with in the past.
Would love to. I'm always interested in having good faith conversations with people, whether they agree or disagree. Love to talk to an intelligent person. Thank you for having me on. It was wonderful to talk to you.
It's been a real pleasure, a real delight. Thank you. And to our audience, as always, keep the faith. Hey, YouTube. Thanks for watching. Just a reminder that this is a podcast. You can catch an extra premium episode every Monday for $5 a month at patreon.com/badfaithpodcast. That's patreon.com/badfaithpodcast for $5 a month, an extra episode every week. Additionally, please do consider liking this video, subscribing to this channel. It helps us out. It helps independent media beat the algorithm. We appreciate you. And as always, keep the faith.